cracking with this evening's session, perhaps if one or two of you could just put some kind of smiley face, yes I can hear you comment, or some such, to make sure the sound's working okay, into your chat facility or question facility on your GoToWebinar toolbar. Just be useful to make sure people can hear me before I plow on. So I'll just hold on whilst I get some feedback. Yep, lovely. That's great. That's enough of you, so thank you for that. Just briefly, a few housekeeping bits and pieces. Tonight's event is a one-way audio broadcast, so you should be able to hear me. That seems to be working fine. You should be able to see the slides on your screen, of course, but you should not be able to see me. I can't see you, and I can't hear you, whatever you're up to and however loud you shout. So to handle questions, of which there are normally a fair few, the fairest way is that during this session, if anything occurs to you, you want an answer, just type it into the GoToWebinar toolbar that you've got. And at the end of the session, I'll let you know when we've drawn the main presentation to close. For those that need to move on and do something else, you're more than welcome to do exactly that. But if you want to listen to answers to the questions, whether you've asked them or not, you know, some people just like to listen to what other people have asked. I'll let you know when we're about to kick off with that session, and you can stay on as long as it takes me to answer the questions. I've got no idea, obviously, how many questions there'll be, but I normally try and answer them all in turn. And for those that want to hang on till the bitter end, you're more than welcome to. But I'll announce that later, and for those that need to disappear on time, you can do so. With regards to this evening's subject, people have been invited, all people, we've got quite a lot of phone calls at the office or emails from people who've been invited to previous webinars, missed them for whatever reason, and so we decided it would be a good idea to invite people who'd missed the earlier events for whatever reason to another session. So that's the sort of background to this, and we're going to cover in the main how to write an interview-winning CV, and linked to that, no pun intended, your LinkedIn profile, and touch on some of the things you need to do to make both of those work better for you. And we're going to touch a few things that you shouldn't be doing, a few things, of course, that you should be doing. And during the session, I'm going to try and draw attention to your own CVs and get you to think about that and give you some sort of self-diagnostic tools. So this isn't just a session about these are the top 10 things you should do on your CV, because they're, generally speaking, they're not that helpful in our experience and the feedback we get from people like you who attend these events. And what's far more practical is actual demonstrable stuff that you can go out and put into practice, or engage our services to help you with if you're so inclined, that will actually make a fundamental difference to how you present yourself to the market. So what we'll go through this evening are a number of things that if you were to do them yourself or to get us to do them on your behalf, will make a difference to both your CV and your LinkedIn profile. Okay, just a little bit about who on earth we are, first of all, for those that don't know. And this is really just to give you some kind of, hopefully, comfort factor that the things that we do, we know work, and that we've got a broad perspective on the marketplace. So we exist as a business to provide CV writing, LinkedIn profile writing, interview coaching services to the masses. People employ us to do that. My own background, again, this is really just to set the scene so that you've got some reasonable idea in terms of how I've seen CVs and do I actually know how they get used and what makes a good CV and what doesn't. I've worked in corporate life. I've employed people as an employer or a representative of an employer within corporate life. I've then, for my sins, been involved in recruitment, and so I've seen the process of selecting people, both in the olden days, almost pre-internet, but also more recently in the job board-driven internet world that we live. I've worked with Matt and the team at CV and Interview Advisors for a few years now, reviewing CVs and occasionally writing them as well. So, and we cover all sectors. So whether you're in IT, accountancy, audit, nurse, doctors, dentists, teachers, we've pretty much written a CV for everybody at every stage in their life, and so we see what works and what doesn't within these different sectors, and we get a fairly good overview. And that's important because that will become clear later this evening why that information is useful. The rest of the team in the business are similar. Interestingly, we have some published authors amongst our ranks. That quality will also become clear as being quite a useful attribute to have when you're writing a CV. And there are going to be a few cliches this evening, and that's just unfortunate because it's sometimes the only way to explain things easily. Hot skills is one of those cliches. What is a hot skill? Well, they change, they evolve, and they develop over time. And whatever sector you're in, whatever job you do, 10 years ago, there were a set of hot skills for that part in the marketplace. Now there are a slightly different set of hot skills, quite possibly. It's really important you understand what they are. If you don't know what your target audience is looking for, your life will become a lot harder when you try and build and develop your CV and LinkedIn profile if you have one. And we're going to talk a bit more about those later. And although this sounds a bit aggressive, it's, I suppose, deliberately designed to do exactly that, I suppose. Ultimately, we're in the business of writing CVs that we know can actually get people results. Smash down doors is a bit aggressive, understand that. But it hopefully makes a point. That's what it's got to do. It's got to make a difference in a fairly crowded marketplace. Now, to illustrate that point, and I've said that, you know, what we do and the kind of things we're going to be talking about this evening, it's important you know they actually work. And the text that's on the slide right now is actually a real-life quote of somebody who attended one of our webinars. In fact, it was either last week or the week before, and we got some really good feedback. And we were able to help this person. They've got a new CV. It went out to the market, and they've been in a tough place for a number of years, really struggling to get any traction or interest. And you can see for yourself if you just read through that text. All of a sudden, they're getting a result. And that's what a lot of people want. And we'll look into the reasons shortly as to why people don't get results, why people maybe don't get the interviews they're looking for or the number of interviews that they're expecting. Normally the reasons are really simple, but if you don't have the knowledge to apply to that particular problem, the danger is you just go on and on and on, beating your head against a brick wall, trying to get some people interested in your abilities and competencies. And if you're not getting that right, it can cause a whole heap of problems. And this person was in that space until literally last week or the week before, and their situation has improved dramatically just by sorting out their CV. So what we're going to talk about does actually work. Firstly, let's just take a little look at what actually is a CV, because there's a lot of misconceptions out there. A lot of people have a lot of views. Some people think, well, a CV is just there's a whole bunch of stuff about me and big deal. And that's part of the problem. If you approach it from that perspective, almost like an afterthought, bit of a rush job one Sunday afternoon, put together my CV and send it out, I can virtually guarantee, with a few exceptions, you'll have a tough time in the marketplace. Some of the things I mentioned earlier on, in terms of forming some kind of self-diagnosis on whether you've got a CV that's working in the marketplace, start to think about some of these things I'm about to talk about and apply them to your own circumstances. So if you've really got a document that is presenting your target audience, now target audience is another phrase I'm going to be using a lot of this evening. It's the people who are looking at your CV. It's a mixture of folk actually. It could be recruiters, it could be junior HR people within a big employer who are doing the sifting and filtering of CVs for job applications. Could be a hiring manager at some stage who's actually going to make a decision on whether they progress your application or not. A whole combination of those people. If all you're doing is presenting those people with a list of things, it's probably not going to work too well. And to reinforce that point, just think about anything you've bought in the last few months or years or even weeks, particularly high-ticket items, so houses, cars, consumer durables, any particular services, and it's highly unlikely you'll have bought them purely on the basis of reading a list of things. So for example, take a car. Yeah, very few people are going to be excited and persuaded to buy a car purely because you were given the dimensions, the length, the width, the height, the boot capacity, the fuel tank size, the wheelbase. that doesn't really excite people, or not the vast majority of people anyway. You're not going to be persuaded to buy a model of car just because of those particular attributes. So imagine that if that was you, you're a product or service to the marketplace, whether you like it or not, that's how people will view you crudely. If all you're doing is going to market with a list of jobs that you've done, qualifications that you've got, and contact details, hobbies and interests and things like that, and there's nothing really behind it, there's no substance, virtually can guarantee you're going to have a hard time in the marketplace with very few exceptions. So that's one thing to watch out for. Ask yourself, is that really what your CV is about? And a lot of people might be thinking, and do indeed say to us from time to time, well, what on earth is it supposed to be if it's not a list of those things? And we'll come on to that later. A bit of a test. If you've ever had to apply for a job which has forced you to go down the application form route, be that written or rare these days, or on the internet, and you've been asked to provide examples of a time when you did such and such, or please provide evidence or proof to support the last time you had to face a tough decision or something like that. Any example where you've had to think a bit and you find it difficult to provide that evidence, maybe because it's not on your CV right now, and you question the sanity of the employer who's bothered to ask you these really difficult questions. If you've been frustrated by that, that's probably telling you there's something wrong with your CV as well. It's particularly prevalent within the public sector. It's increasingly so within large-scale private sector employers, and there are all sorts of other people using them. But the reason why these people use application forms is because they know pretty much most people's CVs fail to hit the mark by sometimes a country mile. So to force people to provide evidence to support their ability to perform the job in hand, they seek to collect that evidence through an application form. So it's another little test. If you find those forms very difficult, if you've encountered them, to fill out and to populate with what you think is the right kind of information, it's probably telling you that your CV is also not that good. Because if you've not done it before and not had to provide that level of information on your CV, the CV is not really where it should be. Again, we'll touch on that very shortly. Also, this is very appropriate for anybody with a career of more than sort of 5 to 10 years. If you're using a CV format that in effect is the same as it was when you left whatever level of education you have, and all you've done is bolt on and add bits to it over time, it probably also indicates that you've got an underperforming CV. It's particularly true the longer your career is, but actually it does have some resonance with people even if they graduated fairly recently, because if the format's wrong still and all you've done is set up a structure of CV that you looked over the shoulder of one of your mates, or somebody in your family said this is how you do a CV, and they're not really qualified to provide that advice, and you set off just assuming that they must be right, again, you could be on the wrong track. But it really harms people who've got a career of sort of double-digit number of years. So start to ask yourself these questions, and if you're starting to think, there's a few of these things that apply to me, then it's starting to tell you you've got a bit of a problem. And it all builds up to probably the biggest message you should take away from this evening, which is that your CV, however you present yourself to your target audience, has got to present to them, in effect, a business case as to why somebody should be considering to hire you, possibly even to interview you, in fairness. CV's main job is to get you an interview, not the job itself, but you've got to present that target audience with that kind of rationale. So going back to our have you bought a product, service or something recently, you were probably influenced by either a salesperson, a brochure, a review, some internet material, some research, most of which will have provided evidence to you as to why you should choose to buy that particular product. So if we go back to the car example, as I said earlier, it's not the list of technical attributes that necessarily will swing the deal. It'll be more emotive than that. It'll be things that hopefully will appeal to your inner being. So if it was a BMW, it's because you like the ultimate drive or whatever their slogan is. If it's a Fiat 500, it's because you've got a sort of retro cultural understanding of all things Italian and cheeky, and hopefully you get the message. All of those brands are presenting a business case to you as to why you should be engaged with them, why you should go and spend your money with them. And although it's not so blatant, you have to take that approach in the marketplace. If somebody's about to sink 25, 35, 55, 120,000 pounds in you every year, they expect to get a return. That might not be immediately obvious, but in this world and this current climate, it's particularly true. Everybody wants to see a return on the investment they're making, and that includes people. Your CV's got to give a pretty big clue to your target audience that you can provide that return on their investment. So we'll talk about more about business cases shortly, because that is the core to making a good CV. So you'll gather now, as a crude measure, bad CV is just a list of stuff with no substance. Good CV presents target audience with a strong business case as to why they should consider interviewing you or hiring you. The other thing that a lot of people get hideously wrong, and particularly is so if your CV is one of those where you started it maybe in the 80s or the 90s and all you've done is add to it over time, is that the way CVs are used in today's marketplace is completely different from that of 10, 15 years ago. And of course, what I'm referring to here is the electronic world that we live in and how your CV is stored and accessed. So a lot of people are aware that they should have keywords and phrases on their CVs, but they've got to be the right keywords and the right phrases, and they've also got to be put in such a way that actually works for you. So a good CV subtly has that in mind. Again, we'll touch on that later. Finally, a really good measure for those that have been active in the job market and can actually start thinking about these stats. Lots of people, this guy I mentioned earlier who we were talking with a couple of weeks ago, whenever it was, who then we helped with their CV, they'd been banging their head against the wall trying to get interviews. So they had the stats aplenty. They knew something was wrong. What they didn't know is what was wrong. It's very hard to get feedback from the marketplace. Very few people are going to tell you to your face your CV is poor. I'm afraid that falls to people like me and my colleagues who review them day in, day out. Some people don't like the fact that we tell them that their CV is poor, but the absolute acid test, whatever anybody tells you about your CV, me included, is if you start applying for jobs, let's take 10 jobs, the caveat being they're jobs you know you could perform. There might be a bit of a stretch, but you could actually perform them. You've got the skills and attributes to be able to perform that role as best you can judge. You apply for 10 of them. If you're getting no interviews, obviously that's a problem. What's the problem? I can virtually guarantee it's the CV. There might be a few other things, but predominantly the CV was a problem. If you're getting 1, 2, 3 interviews out of the 10, it still indicates the CV is a problem. You should be getting a higher hit rate than that. If you're getting 7, 8, 9, 10 interviews out of the 10, that's pretty good, in fairness, and you could argue there's not much you should be doing, as long as that's generating enough level of interest for you to ultimately get job offers, or a job offer, which you're prepared to accept. And if you're somewhere in the middle, the 4, 5, 6s, then it's a judgment call. Again, it all depends whether that's going to generate enough opportunities to get job offers. And the critical thing being, from those interviews, are you progressing through to other stages of the interview process, or are you only ever getting first interviews or interviews with recruiters? And I would caveat this stat that really, if your CV is getting you interviews with decision makers, you should count them. If you're merely getting interviews with recruiters, or predominantly with recruiters, and it's not going any further, I wouldn't count that. The recruiter's not necessarily seeing you purely for the means of appointing you or selecting you for interview with their client per se. You have to be very careful about that. They may have other motives lurking behind why they might want to meet with you. And as I said earlier, getting feedback is really difficult. So a lot of people, recruiters, employers will very rarely give a view for obvious reasons, but I guarantee lots of employers will be having conversations with their recruiters about the quality of CVs. And I've been in rooms where people have said, as bluntly as, I am not going to interview that person because their CV is, and then they've inserted a 4-word expletive, and it's that blunt. Now, the recruiter, what do? They're not going to come and say to you, unless they know you very well, I'm afraid you're not going to get the interview because your CV is, and then repeat the expletive. It's just not going to happen. What you're probably going to hear is better people for the job, more experienced people. You're overqualified, underqualified. There are lots of job applicants. Well, so what? If there are lots of job applicants and you're genuinely a good candidate for the role, you should still be getting an interview. And so it nearly always points, 99 times out of 100, the key problem is the CV. The message you've sent to your target audience has not been accepted. It's not been interpreted in the way you'd like it to have been. You don't get an interview. And it's that brutal. So for those that have been in the market who can collect the stats, if you've got them and it's telling you a bad thing, then at least you know you need to do something. You need to fix the CV. How you do it we'll come on to, but you need to take some action. For those that are currently in the market or haven't recently been in the market, then some of the questions we've just talked about, some of the issues we've just talked about will give you clues as to whether your CV will work in the marketplace. And then it's a question of whether do you do something proactively about it, or do you wait for the job applications to be made before you then retrospectively review whether you've got a CV that's performing or not. And that's a risk you have to make a decision. You have to take that risk, because have you got that number of opportunities to burn is only something you can judge. The comment right at the bottom of this slide, I've made and drawn reference to the fact that a particular individual used one of these webinars and our advice to help them. Generally speaking, and this applies to a well-written CV. Now that could be well written by a professional CV writer, it could be well written by the individual who's just got a talent to do it once they understand the format and structure. But if you get that document better aligned, we see on average a significant double-digit increase in people getting interviews. So it is a dramatic improvement, but for some very simple fixes, which we'll come on to. So structurally, we're going to talk a little bit now about how do you actually structure a good CV, what should you be doing, and there are three main parts to this. There are more parts in a typical CV. So if you look at the headings on your own CV right now, you've probably got anywhere between 5 and 8 typically, something like that anyway. We're going to look at all of those areas, or the key ones, but there are three really important ones, and we're going to deal with those in order right now, that help to build this business case. So remember, that's the most important thing. It's all about building a business case as to why should somebody be interested in you for a particular opportunity or opportunities. And we open up the CVs we write for our clients with some kind of opening summary. Now, lots of people do this already. So if you've got something like a personal profile or a professional profile, or we tend to call it a professional or executive summary, it doesn't really matter what you call it. That's not going to make the blindest bit of difference. What does make the difference is the content that follows shortly afterwards. And it makes a big difference. And this literally, for some people, can be make or break. So don't be under any illusions about how much time people give your CVs. You may have heard some stats thrown around by various people, but typically, and this is where some of this knowledge that we have pays off, because we see people processing CVs. We watch people looking at job applications. Now just imagine, a lot of people think they've applied for the job, then the recruiter or the HR person within the employer is going to sit down with a cup of coffee and conduct an in-depth analysis into the individual CV. That may happen at a much later stage, but isn't going to happen if anything more than 30 or 40 people applied for the same job. And typically these days you're getting often well over 100 applications for even relatively specialist jobs. It doesn't actually make any difference whether the people who have applied are relevant for the job or not, and I guarantee there will always be a third probably of applicants who are totally irrelevant for the job. Doesn't stop them from applying, creating noise in the system. Somebody's got to deal with that paperwork, so to speak, the applications. So if your CV's in there amongst the mix, let's say there are 100 applicants for the job, you're probably going to get somebody's time and attention to do that initial filtering, because nobody's going to interview 100 people. Nobody in their right mind is going to invest that amount of time. So they need to whittle it down to, I don't know, somewhere between 5 and 10 pretty quickly. So guess what? You are going to get probably 5 to 20 seconds, maybe 30 seconds if you're lucky, of somebody's time to make that initial decision. So this opening statement that you make to the world, if it's too generic, pointing in the wrong direction, not giving off a good message, you'll lose that person's attention, the recruiter or the HR person's attention, within those first 5 seconds or so, and there's a danger you'll lose the opportunity there and then. So what should this opening statement have? And again, start thinking about what you've got on your CV right now if you've got any form of opening statement. Hasten to add, if you've not got an opening statement and you open it up with your education or you jump straight into your career history, that's a big risk for reasons we'll see shortly. The first and most obvious thing, and it is very obvious but hardly anybody does it, is describe what on earth you are. So this can be generic. So if you're a project manager, you might have a fancy title, but if your skill is project management, mention it or something very like it. If you're a teacher, mention it and maybe the level that you're operating at. If you've got an MBA or a degree of particular worth, it might be worth inserting the words graduate such and such or MBA qualified such and such beforehand. That's how you get over the level of intellect you have. But make a statement about what you actually are. So for example, if you're a recruiter and you've got 100 applications in front of you for, let's say, a project manager, you want to be pretty clear that the people you're going to even bother to give time to are in that space. You just want to find that confirmation and validity pretty quickly, because amongst the 100 applicants, as I indicated earlier, you'll find all manner of people who've never been a project manager or anywhere near a project in their lives, but they've still applied for the job. So they get weeded out quite quickly. The big danger is if you don't make it clear that you are a project manager, you'll be weeded out as well, and they'll never read any further down to find out that you might actually be the world's best project manager. And that happens quite a lot of time. So make it very clear what you are. We'll take a look at a real-life example shortly, and so you get an idea of how this all fits together. Second most important thing is describe as quickly as possible what your worth is to the world. A cliche again, value proposition. A lot of people don't understand that. We'll talk a little bit about it. Actually, it's not that hard. If somebody's going to invest X number of pounds in you every year, what is the biggest thing that you're going to offer in return? If you're a project manager, it might be that you can deliver certain size projects on time within budget consistently. That's your value proposition. If you're a teacher in a primary school within a certain arena or year group, it's your ability to be able to take those people to a certain standard with the various key stages that exist. If you're a salesperson, it may be your ability to either manage existing customers profitably or to develop new business, which is a real talent and skill to have, particularly in the current climate. So it's that nugget, it's that, why am I sinking an amount of money into you, Mr. or Mrs. Individual, what am I going to get back? So many people miss that by a country mile. And then linked to that, other things you're good at, maybe 3 to 4 things that you're particularly strong at that you can get across to your target audience. And importantly, and absolutely critically, those hot skills again, you've got to align that lot with what people are expecting to see. So where a lot of people go wrong and get rejected quite quickly is because they write what they think is important from their own individual perspective because they're too close to what they've been doing for the last few years, totally ignore what the target audience is actually looking for, and as a consequence get rejected. Or don't understand what the target audience is looking for, so can't hit that target in the first place. And it's absolutely critical that you put this package together which says, first of all, I'm pretty much what you're looking for. So job title-wise, function-wise, sector-wise, I'm in the space that you, Mr. or Mrs. Recruiter, are looking for. Secondly, I know you're going to be looking to spend whatever number of pounds goes with the role to deliver a return in some way or fashion or other, and I can do that. And here are the things that I'm particularly good at, which, surprise, surprise, are pretty much what you're looking for as well, because I know that. And you don't have to be spot on, but you have to be reasonably accurate. That's the first part of building a strong business case. Here's an example. Now, I stress this is for as you can see, a finance director. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether you've just graduated, whether you've got 35 years experience. It doesn't matter which country you're in, what job sector you're in, what role you have, who you worked for. None of that matters. Everybody can write something like this that hits those 4 bullet points at the top of the slide. I'm not going to read it verbatim, you can see it for yourself, but this addresses what are they? They're a finance director. What's the value proposition? Well, amongst other things, they protect cash flow and profitability. What are they particularly good at? There's a list of things. Are they aligned with the hot skills in this particular person's marketplace? Well, we have to assume that because we don't know. We don't know the individual, we don't know the job they're applying for, but there's enough evidence there to suggest they probably are hitting a few of the hot spots. So I stress, this has got nothing to do with the level you're at. You could have just left school with GCSEs. You could still write something like this. It's just different. The content varies. You have to make it relevant. But everybody can write something like this. Now, thinking about your own CVs and thinking about most of the CVs that I see day in, day out, if you've got in your current opening statement, if you have one, any reference to your enthusiasm, communication skills, interpersonal skills, dedication, the classic one is can work well in a team as well as on my own, or can work on my own initiative as well as in the team. All of that, I'm afraid to say, is pretty much useless as far as getting you an interview. If you're an employer, you'll have set out, most employers will have an idea about what they're looking for, and the clever ones will have a matrix that has on one side desirable skills, essential skills, and maybe some guide on when they're going to assess those skills. So yes, they are looking for people who are enthusiastic, dedicated, committed, good interpersonal skills, and may well be good at working in a team or on their own. But they're not going to judge that from the CV, guarantee you. They're not going to take your word just because you mention those things. They're going to judge those things at interview or at assessment centre. So putting them on your CV is wholly pointless because most recruiters, their eyes will glaze over, they'll ignore it. Most hiring managers are fed up of seeing it. Again, they won't tell you to your face, unfortunately, but they're just fed up of seeing it. What they want to see is, what have you got to offer? How do you fit this role? Are you a valid candidate? Do I see something in you that proves to me I should be interviewing you, that compels me to want to meet up with you? And that's not about your enthusiasm, dedication, interpersonal skills, commitment, or working in a team or as an isolated individual. None of those things make any difference whatsoever. So get rid of them on your CV. If you've got them, it's harming you, almost guaranteed. I'm going to look at one more section. So I mentioned that there were 3 key areas to get right to build your business case. The whole CV is a business case, but there are 3 areas that make the biggest difference. So we've dealt with one, the opening statement. We're going to now look at another section, still on page 1, and then I'll show you a real-life example about how it all hangs together. So the second area we tend to call key skills, areas of expertise. Again, it doesn't really matter what you're calling it, but it's an area that aesthetically works well, but also deals with the electronic world that we live in. Before I just go into detail about this particular section, the comment at the bottom is relevant, although seemingly obvious at first glance, and that is that the vast majority of recruiters and hiring managers make their shortlisting decisions solely based on the contents of your CV. And you might think, well, yeah, of course they do. How else are they going to do it? And that is the very point. So a lot of people are under the misguided view that the CV tells part of the story and the interview they'll magically give the other part of the story, or that somehow recruiters and hiring managers must have a crystal ball or some kind of strange ethereal experience or tool that will give them insight that couldn't possibly be known by anybody else. And of course none of that exists. If you're sending information to a recruiter or hiring manager, which is your CV, they can only make a decision based on that in the majority of cases. The little 8%, the difference between 100% and 92%, are the people that might actually know you from previous experience. So there's always exceptions to the rule, but the vast majority of individuals don't know you as recruiters or hiring managers. They can only judge you from what you've sent them. There's no other means that they can judge you. So if you get that message wrong, guess what? You're highly unlikely to be successful, or not as successful as you'd like. So it's absolutely critical you get that message sorted, which of course is what this evening is all about. So this key skills area, it's a menu of things that you can reflect back to your target audience, skills that you possess that people would expect to see. So again, if we're talking about project manager, it might be that you're Prince 2 qualified. If you're a teacher, it might be that you're educating a particular level or have experience with particular age groups or subject matters. If you're into finance, it might be that you've got profit and loss experience, payroll experience, or a certain level of experience within particular software packages. But the secondary advantage of this is that it's a great area where you can actually table the SEO here on the slide, stands for search engine optimization. So it's a great way of being able to build in these keywords and phrases that people actually look for and search for, importantly. So here are just a few examples that would appear pretty much like this on a typical CV if we were writing it. They've a finance slant to them, but that doesn't make any difference. So you pick examples that are relevant to you. Many of you will have these skills on your CV already, but I guarantee most people will have behavioural ones mixed in, if not all. So again, if you've got anything like enthusiasm, good interpersonal skills, presentation skills, timekeeping, commitment, they're all a bit wishy-washy. How do you prove them on a CV? They're almost impossible to prove. So get rid of all of that behavioural nonsense and focus on functional skills that at a later stage could be proven on the CV, but importantly reflect what the target audience is actually looking for. Now there are clues. Most job descriptions or job advertisements will specify the kind of skills being sought, but don't be suckered in, because some jobs do say we want people who are enthusiastic, we want people who are team players. Now, just putting that on your CV will not get you the interview. As I said earlier, people don't take that at face value. What they are implying by that is that at some point during the interview process, they will assess that as a skill and make their judgment on it. So on the CV, you've got to focus on things you can actually prove. And they could be technical skills, they could be functional skills, but they're things that you could actually provide evidence to back up at a later stage, more of which later. Okay, I'll show you an example, because the key skills area is more as much of an aesthetic thing as it is anything else. If you just bear with me, on the screen right now is, it's just taking a little while to refresh, but you should see now, it's actually the guy that runs our businesses, his CV, but it's his real CV. It's structured in a way that we pretty much structure all of the clients that we work with, so it's a typical example. But of course it's got information on there that's not relevant to any individual per se other than Matt, so it's non-threatening and won't embarrass anybody. You can see we've fairly, I'll come back to this subject later, but unlike a lot of people's CVs, you'll notice that we're not leading with where Matt lives. In most cases totally irrelevant, come on to that later. We're not delving into Matt's education, which a lot of people lead with. Again, unless you've got stratospherically good qualifications, that's not the most important thing to lead with. And we're not diving straight into Matt's career. In fact, there's nothing that you can see on the page currently visible to you that describes what Matt's current role is in any detail with any dates or times. Again, deliberate, for reasons we'll touch on later. So what it is saying, though, is it's positioning in the mind of the reader, what is Matt, what's his value proposition, what's he good at, and again we're assuming that that would be aligned to the hot skills in his marketplace. And then this bullet point area is the kind of key skills, key areas of expertise, whatever you want to call it. But this is the bit that if you vary it, you hit a number of nails on the head, one of which is visually it's just reassuring that Matt's got certain skills that his target audience might be looking for, and it just makes people, it's very easy to read very quickly. So that 5 to 30 seconds you've got, it's getting across the message of what he's got to offer very quickly. But more importantly, or as importantly at least these days, if his CV is lying on a database somewhere. So remember, as soon as your CV leaves your outbox, it's likely to hit a job board and their database, then be picked up by a recruiter and they'll have a database of their own. It's likely then to be passed to an employer at some stage, and for some of them they'll have databases or application tracking systems. And for the larger of any of those groups, of course, the only means then you're going to be found thereafter, unless it's for that specific opportunity, is by somebody doing a search at some point in time on behalf of a client or because they've got a specific role to fill. but it all then hinges on how visible is your CV based on whoever's doing the searching. Now, if you're good at using Google, for example, and you know how to use Boolean logic, you can really get a fine-tuned search on Google, despite the billions of pages that exist within it. But a lot of people don't really know how to use the software at their disposal, so most people don't make the most of Office, for example. Most people don't make the use of Google very well as far as its search technology is concerned, and guess what? Most recruiters, by and large, aren't experts at their own software. They may not have been given the training to use it properly. They might have done, but they might not have done. New starters, people at the bottom end doing the initial research, may not be experts yet at using their software. So they'll be entering in either words or phrases. They may not be making the most powerful use of the software at their disposal, yet they're still responsible for finding talent, individuals, candidates for their clients or their bosses. And you've got to try and maximize the chances of your CV being pulled out and being one of those selected for further attention. And this table of bullet points is one way just to get in those keywords and phrases without it appearing odd or forced. And you can change these quite quickly to reflect the skills being sought for a particular opportunity without having to spend hours revamping your CV. What's important, of course, is you get the right terminology. And if you don't know what that terminology is, then we suggest you seek some help, because a lot of people just put the wrong things in here. They put waffle and stuff that isn't important. So that's the first two sections. Now, right at the bottom here, we've got an area called Career Highlights. We're going to talk about that next, and sort of conclude the three most important parts of the CV as far as building a business case. So just a quick recap, we've introduced this person, the individual. We're then bullet pointing some key skills or attributes that are functional, not behavioral. And of course, in those two sections, we're making claims. We're saying, it's not boastful, it's not egotistical, it's factual. It's saying, yeah, I as an individual have got certain skills and abilities which, if I've done my job properly, are pretty close to what I know you're looking for. But there's not much evidence yet. There's not really much proof. So if you were very harsh, you could say, okay, well, big deal, where's the proof? So that's the next part of the CV. And again, where a lot of people tend to go wrong, they don't provide enough evidence to back up the claims they've made, if they've made any claims at all. So the next section on the CV is all about proving claims that have earlier been made. And you'll have gathered, therefore, that your ability to write content is really important here. If you can't write good content, if you find it difficult to describe things that have happened to you in a nice, concise manner, then again, my suggestion would be to start thinking of seeking help rather than battling against it. Because if you make a hash of this next area, again, it works against you rather than for you. But we have a useful tool, which is not unique to us. There are many versions of this kind of acronym lurking around in business world. But we use a tool called STAR. The STAR stands for Situation, Task, Actions, Results. There are similar ones, as I say, floating around. And it's a great way of being able to deconstruct fairly complex happenings or events in your life and then reconstructing them in a fairly concise manner. It's also, incidentally, a really good way of being able to deal with competency-based questions. So if you get into the habit of trying to break things down that have happened to you, achievements, projects, things you're proud of, if you can start to work this around in your mind and A, write good content, but also be able to deal with it verbally, you become much better equipped to deal with interviews, particularly in this current era, which tend to be focused on proof and evidence of competences. So let's take a look at an example. Again, I'm not going to read through this at length, it's pointless, but this is typically a career highlight. It actually is off Matt's CV, as we'll see later, so it's real life, and I'm just going to break it down into the sections so you can see how we got here. It's a fairly complex project. It would have taken up a lot of Matt's time, but it involves enterprise rent-a-car. That's what the ERAC stands for. So the first sentence of this paragraph is the situation. So you can read that, and it's all about enterprise rent-a-car acquiring a business that basically needed sorting out. So that's the situation. So the situation is a scene setter, if you like, a headline. It's the the background to this particular event. So relatively straightforward. The second sentence, started appointed, is the task. And this is the responsibility resting on Matt's shoulder at that moment in time with the situation in hand. So he was appointed operations manager to do a variety of things. The bulk of the remaining, the paragraph is, remaining paragraph are the actions. So it's typically 3 to 6 things, not often any more than that for reasons of space, but a handful of things that Matt did to resolve or progress the task in hand. And then the final sentence is the result. And so you can see that he succeeded in rebranding the business, achieving a certain level of profitability within a certain timescale. So it's quite punchy, quite impactful, but most importantly, it's hard evidence to back up claims that he made earlier on his CV about being able to affect change, to make things happen, as we'll see later. Now, most people, when they write a career highlight, or achievements as most people tend to call it, fail to be as concise as this, and often provide too little information or way too much information. Very hard to get the balance right. And you and I, nobody will ever know whether, in fairness, this is exactly the right amount of balance for every individual under the sun. Nobody could possibly guarantee that. But time after time after time, in combination with the other 2 sections I've talked about, the feedback we get is that this is the biggest difference that people make. It's a hard proof. It's almost, you can see the relief on recruiters or hiring managers' faces when they see a CV that has actually taken the time to say, look, I'm in the right space, I'm a valid applicant for your job, I've got the skills, here's the proof. It makes such an enormous difference. The other important thing about this is on page 1 of the CV. A lot of people bury their achievements, and sometimes the best achievements, the most relevant achievements, way down the batting order because they're confined to chronological order. That is a mistake because, as I said earlier, if you're getting 5 to 20 seconds of somebody's time, they'll never get to page 2 or 3. In fact, there's plenty of people whose page 2, 3, 4, whatever of their CV have never been read. They don't know it, but it's never happened. So that's a really good example of the career highlight. I'll show you in a minute how it looks on Matt's CV, but a few words of caution, which I've sort of hinted at in a way. One of which is that if you pick the wrong examples, or examples that actually don't really have much of a relevance to or an impact to your target audience, at best it's neutral, but it actually can harm your chances because it might look like you're a bit of a failure if you go on about something that's got no real end point to it. So be careful, you pick the right examples, and linked to that, you've got to make sure you go to market with the right examples. Now, there's a lot of people mix up what they thought were the most important things in their life, or which excited them the most or interested them the most, as being the best achievements to lead with. And that's not necessarily the case. Often, for a lot of people, the strongest achievements that they have are the ones that cause them the most pain and anguish. They just don't know it until somebody points it out to them. So a lot of our work goes into working with our clients and understanding what they've done, what the target audience is expecting to find, and matching the two. And often it's not the examples that the individuals come to us trumpeting, because they're not always the right or most relevant examples of ability. Matt's example that I showed you had a reasonable end point conclusion, quite punchy. So if you've got it, make sure you put down the key performance indicator element. You know, if you're a salesperson, you beat target by X amount, or you brought in a certain amount of new revenue. If you're a teacher, you were able to take people from key stage X to key stage Y in a short period of time, or consistently, or you've taken underperformers to become to standard or above. If you're a project manager, as I said earlier, it's about managing projects of a certain size to time or to budget. Some people don't have roles where these are easy to grab hold of. It's not easy to make a strong point, and I wouldn't worry too much about it. There are ways of articulating those examples to best effect. So they get hung up about, yeah, but my job isn't that. I'm just a small cog in a massive wheel. That's okay. It's just about finding good examples to give. But if you've got quantifiable evidence to support them, so much the better. As I hinted at earlier, it's where we spend most of our time when we're working with our clients. This takes a lot of time and effort. And so a seed I'm beginning to sow in your mind, hopefully, is that if you think you can visit your CV on a Sunday afternoon whilst the telly is on, or the rugby, football, whatever it is, and just make a few changes, I'm afraid it's not that simple. It takes a root and branch review of what's in your toolkit and aligning that with what your audience is expecting to see to be truly effective. But if you put the effort in, it can make a big difference. Reminder at the bottom, there's been a few people joining mid-session, so they might not have seen this bit. Acid test, as I said right up front, for your CV is whether you're getting interviews for jobs. If you're not getting the right level of interviews, I can virtually guarantee to you the CV is the root cause of the problem. Nothing to do with you personally, because most people don't know you from Adam. Everything to do with the message you're sending out into the marketplace. Difficulty is, as I also said earlier, is getting people to tell you that to your face. And that's the biggest problem, because until they do, you don't have any means to decide 100% that that's the problem. You could be persuaded that the problem lies elsewhere. But I can tell you it's nearly always a CV. Let's just take a look at Matt's CV quickly, because there's a couple of important points here. Before I show you the career highlights section in any detail, roughly what you see on screen now is often roughly what a recruiter would see if they're dealing with lots of applications for their jobs. And this is that sort of 5 to 20, 30-second rule kind of comment. So just imagine, you may not know this, but most recruiters these days, they advertise a course in multiple areas, so lots of different job boards, lots of different websites. But they normally have, most of the medium to larger size recruiters will have some aggregating software, which will pool all of the applications together in one place from wherever they've come. And they'll have a screen not dissimilar to what you're looking at the moment for each applicant. So it'll have a name, a hit on the link, it'll open up a CV, and they'll just give it a quick glance. Now, if you've got 100 applications, pretty much what you're looking at now is pretty much what they'll read before making a decision. If you're lucky, they might take the magnification down a bit, and probably the most they'll see is now what you see on your screen or about to see on your screen. It's still page one and not quite all of it is the message. So if whatever you're communicating to the marketplace is ineffective in this particular area of the CV, that's where your problem lies. If that's what the recruiter's looking at and they give you that cursory glance, they'll make their decision, and literally on their screen they'll have often a red, an amber and a green button. Red, unsurprisingly, is of no interest whatsoever, and if you're lucky, that's linked to a thanks but no thanks email that comes hurtling in your general direction. More often than not, you don't hear anything. Amber is might look at it again, possible. Green is almost certainly take a look at some of the time. Now, for those people, those that get the green button, then your CV will get a more intensive review, either by that person or their boss or their client. So that's why it's so brutal. Don't think that people are going to scroll through the whole document and give you that amount of time. Now, as you can see on screen now, you can see the three sections that we talked about, the three most important sections: opening summary, bullet points, career highlights. That's building a strong business case as to why somebody should be interested in seeing Matt. He would hope. Now, you'll also notice we've still not mentioned where Matt works, deliberately so. So it's really important you build that business case, and then you can move on, as we will talk about shortly, to the bottom of page one, where we're describing where Matt actually works. It is important that that is on page one. If you've got a CV where you've got lots of stuff on it that isn't at least ending at the bottom of page one with where you currently or have most recently worked, there is enough evidence to suggest that that's not such a good thing. So there is a balancing act. You've got to get the business case built, but you can't do it to such a degree that you push your current or most recent role to page 2 or beyond of the CV. Okay, just a quick reminder for those, again, who maybe joined late. If you've got any questions, because this is an audio one-way broadcast, by all means type them into the GoToWebinar facility you've got, and I'll go through them one by one at the end of this session. And I will say to people, obviously we've finished the main session, you can either go, but if you want to listen to the answers to the questions, you're more than willing to hang on, and I'll go through them one by one. So we've dealt with the most important parts of the CV as far as building its business case, the 3 opening sections that we just looked at. Of course, we have to now talk about what on earth you've been doing in the time that you've had your career running that sort of justifies some of the claims that you've made on your CV. People like to see the chronological order of things. There's quite a few issues here, but I'll whiz through them because examples are the best way of demonstrating this. It is important you get the structure of this right. Most people do go in reverse chronological order, but there are 1 or 2 people every month we see who start with their earliest role, bizarrely, and then move backwards. So their current role lands up on page 3 of the CV, and when they started working in the 70s, 80s, or 90s is on the first page of the CV. If you are one of the few people that still do that, please change that tomorrow, tonight, but before you do anything with the CV. Most people, however, get it in the right way. They go start with the most recent or current role and work backwards. That's what you should do. And as I said, make sure you're starting that on page 1. What most people tend not to do, and this is important no matter who you work for, is describe who on earth they are working for, so their employer. A lot of people assume that somehow, again, the recruiter or hiring manager will mysteriously understand every business in the land, and of course they don't. And even for the big brands, they have lots of subdivisions or sister companies, so don't assume that people know who you're working for purely by you mentioning their name, even if you work for a relatively well-known brand. Take a little while to explain. I'll show you an example shortly. Take a little while to explain who that employer is, what your role is within that employer, the structure of any team you belong to, things that you're measured on, yes, some duties and responsibilities, balance that with achievements. So don't dump your job description into your CV, which a lot of people do, and assume that's going to work. Certainly don't repeat the same duties and responsibilities ad infinitum. So if you've done a credit control job at Joe Bloggs PLC and you list your duties and responsibilities, it's really not very exciting if then the next job you had, your earlier role, was also credit controller, and guess what, your duties and responsibilities were pretty much the same thing. You'd be surprised how many people list it, and if you're guilty of that, again, obviously you can keep that to yourselves. That's your little secret, but it's harming your chances. So if you've got a CV that pretty much says the same thing for each of the roles you've done over time, that really is a killer. So balance, you've got to have a bit about duties and responsibilities, but you've got to balance that with what you actually did with them. Most job roles in different companies have similar, it's the most similar job roles, I should say. Like, let's take credit controller as an example. If you're a credit controller with Joe Bloggs PLC, very similar duties and responsibilities to credit controller for another PLC. So listing them, wholly pointless on the CV, because when you're judged against your peer group, how does the recruiter or hiring manager decide whether they're any good at that job? They can't. So they think, big deal. What will differentiate you is what you've actually done with those duties and responsibilities, so your achievements. Balance anything you mention about your role with those achievements. It's really important. Sometimes appropriate to talk about reason for leaving, but only positive stuff. So promotion, headhunted, selected by a former manager, anything that's positive, not redundancy, seeking greater career opportunities, money, or lack of. They're not good reasons. Here's some examples. So the red, green, and blue text deals with the summary of the person's role. Again, ignore the level. That's not important. Everybody can write this kind of stuff if you've had a job. So very brief indicator. What was your role all about? A bit about the size of the company involved or that you were employed by. Then a bit about the team. So in this case, it's the team that the person was managing, but it's also you could mention who you reported into and how that fit into the great scheme of things, so people get an idea about what you're used to. And then a bit about KPIs, what you're measured on. We'll take a look at Matt's CV just to show you how that sort of works. And if you Just bear with the screen refresh. What you should be looking at now, most of you, is a bottom of page 1 of Matt's CV, headed Career History, and the top of page 2. And so you can see, we're not asking people to put masses of detail. So Matt's been able to describe what on earth the CVIA group is, because most people would never have heard of it. So he's just describing briefly what do they do. He's then describing his role, briefly what that involves. He's then describing a bit about the team and things that he's measured on and responsible for. And then you'll notice about a third of the way down page 2, key achievements / assignments, things that he's been involved with, things that he's done. They're the things that differentiate him from any other MD of a career enhancement business out there. Not that there are that many of them, but it differentiates him from other people who could be claiming to be MDs of a similar business. So that's the importance of it. Now you'll notice there's quite a lot of detail for his first role. That's deliberate and relevant, of course. Most recruiters and hirers will be making a decision based on your most recent or current employment and for a short while before then. Again, we'll touch on that very shortly. So it's worth putting the effort into a role, particularly if you've had a role for a fair few years, you put enough detail into it. It's important because that's what you'll be judged on. Before we look at the rest of the CV, which is really the sort of the tail end bit, it's not that it's not important, it's just that it's not the bit that makes the biggest difference as whether you get an interview or not. A moment of brief reflection. Now I promised some self-diagnosis tests. Now you should have enough evidence now to start to think, do you have a document that's powerful enough to go to market and serve you well? You might not know that for sure. If you don't, more than happy to take a look at it and make a judgment on it from our perspective. But if you should be able to start to think, okay, if you're in the marketplace or have been in the marketplace recently, have I been getting a sufficient level of interviews? You can answer that. That should be a fairly quick yes or no. If you're not in the marketplace, you then start to think, you start to need thinking about whether your CV is actually building a business case or not to your target audience, or is it really just giving them a list of things for which they'd be hard pushed to differentiate you from anybody else in the marketplace? And a clue as to whether it's building a proper business case or anywhere near a business case for that matter is whether your CV contained any relevant evidence of your success or ability. Now, if you're starting to think, oh dear, I'm not really hitting many of those with big green ticks, worse still, lots of big red crosses, then you probably need to do something. Now what you do, well, there are 3 options. I've only mentioned 2 of them because one of the options is you don't do anything at all, and of course that seems to me to be pretty silly. So option 1 is you do it yourself, you fix it. Option 2 is you get somebody to help you. That could be us, could be others out there. We'd like you to think it could be us. And if you're starting to think, it's your decision at the end of the day, but if you're starting to go down that route and thinking, I need help, I can't be bothered, I'll get somebody to help me, at the end of this session, there's some really good discounts we offer that might help give you a solution to the problem. Obviously, from what you've learned tonight, you should be able to go away and you could make a reasonable stab of it yourselves, but never forget that key measure, will it perform in the marketplace? Now, on to the rest of the CV briefly. Earlier career. Now, for most people, if you've got a career of more than 8 to 10 years, you don't want to be providing the level of detail I just showed you on Matt's CV for all of those jobs, because it just makes a nonsense of any reasonable length of document. So generally speaking, this is a person, you have to look on this case-by-case basis, so I can't give you a cast iron, do this, do that answer, because it depends on so many factors. But as a rule of thumb, 8 to 10 years in some detail, so from now backwards 8 to 10 years, or 4 jobs if you've had quite a few jobs in that 8 to 10 years, and draw a line there and say, right, that's it. And we have big arguments sometimes with people about this, but really you will not gain any interviews based on what happened in the 70s, 80s or 90s, or even the early noughties in your career now. People just aren't interested. So abbreviate your earlier career, and literally, you'll soon see this on Matt's CV, 1 line. From this date to that date, this was the employer, this was my job title. Nothing else, not necessary, with very few exceptions. Education, qualifications and such like, just a few, oh, sorry, just gone one too far then, I'm way too excited. As regarding education, you'll have noticed it wasn't on page 1 of Matt's CV, and it would rarely be so for anybody that we work with, even if you just graduated, to be honest, unless, as I said earlier, you have stratospherically good educational qualifications. You can get the message about the level of intellect you have in different ways. And for those with us early on, in that professional summary, you can open it up with a graduate educated or a BA honours, such and such, or a Prince 2 qualified, or an MBA qualified. You can describe yourself by using your education as an advantage, or a multilingual if you had language capabilities. Otherwise, the rest of your education and such related subjects towards the back of the CV, because they're not the most differentiating thing. If, like most people who've got a degree, it's a 2-1 or a 2-2, hundreds, if not well, of course, thousands of people, tens of thousands maybe, will have that level of education. So it's not the most differentiating thing. It's not the most important thing to your target audience. So back of the CV. Ditto personal details. A lot of people say, well, why do you put it to the back of the CV? Surely I should open it up. That should be the first thing on my CV. Well, I can't hand on heart say it's going to cause you a huge amount of problems, but it will if you live in a strange place and people judge you based on what they think an average person could commute or would be prepared to tolerate. So we've had plenty of people who live in a strange part of the world who'd be quite happy to work in a part of the world quite far away from the strange part of the world, but get rejected because somebody else is assuming that that can't possibly be done, or that their client may feel that it was an unreasonable commute, or that there's an assumption that the person, they're not paying relocation for the job, so how can the person make this work? And actually the individual may be quite comfortable with relocating. They might have family nearby, who knows? So don't let the address become a differentiator for the wrong reasons. Literally a postcode lottery. So we always recommend putting the address towards the back of the CV. It's not a differentiator for you to get an interview. Variety of other information that goes in this section. Again, we'll see on Matt's CV how it looks, but it could include all sorts of things. Driving license, yes. Mobility in the sense of, are you able to relocate or looking to relocate or actively in the process of relocating or considering working Monday to Thursdays in one location and the weekends travelling back. You could mention things like that if they were relevant. Security clearance, languages, eligibility to work in a particular part of the world, all important things to put depending on their relevance to the target audience. And then finally, before we looked at a couple of other optional extras on the CV and indeed LinkedIn very briefly, you'll have noticed if you've been reading Matt's CV in particular, it's written in a particular style. We use what's called the active tense. There's no reference to Matt by his name other than the top of the CV. So it's not Matt did this, Matt did that, which is not a good habit to have on your CV. Nor does it say, from Matt's perspective, I did this, I did that. It's written in the third person. And urban myth, it goes without saying that you really do need to make sure there are no spelling mistakes because there still are too many on CVs. And it's in this current climate particularly, it's just too easy reason. A recruiter will instantly dismiss an obvious spelling mistake on a CV, irrespective of the qualities of the individual. It's just too easy, and nobody will moan that the recruiter made a mistake. So make sure that's not an issue. Urban myth about number of pages of the CV. A lot of people say I must have a one-page CV, or typically and most popularly I must have a two-page CV, whereas there's actually no evidence to support that at all. Lots of comment about it, but no real evidence. Most of the CVs we write for our clients are probably 3 pages, particularly for those with more than 10 years experience, and nobody's ever come back to us and said you're a bunch of idiots, you give me a 3-page CV and now I'm unemployable. It just doesn't happen. What does happen, if you ask the employers, is that they're fed up of getting poor quality CVs. So in a desperate attempt to reduce the amount of rubbish heading their way, they reduce the size of CVs often, or encourage that to be reduced. So they have less stuff to look at, basically. But that's a subtle difference. Anybody reading a good quality 3-page, to be honest, even 4-page document, they might not read all of it, but they'll have got the good message by then, and they won't be bothered that it was 3 or 4 pages long. The only exception to that is where people have specifically asked for a CV of a certain length, and of course then you should respect that wish. Final section of a CV, and then I'll show you Matt's example again. A lot of people put references available on request, and hopefully if you think about it, and there are even some serious people saying put that on your CV. Why? What is the point of putting those words on your CV if you think about it? Your CV is to get you the interview, not to get you the job. By the time you're made a job offer, most people have forgotten about your CV. When you're made the job offer, shortly before or afterwards, you will be asked for references. People don't go back to your CV and think, did this person give us permission? They'll ask you to fill out a form or go find some references or to provide them. It happens much later in the process, so there's no point in either putting references on your CV unless you're asked for them, or mentioning that they're available on request, because people will ask for them whether they're available or not as part of the process. So don't waste space with that stuff. But if you are going to do anything that maybe supports your abilities from a third-party perspective, put recommendations on your CV, a bit like LinkedIn. Take the text and stick it on your CV. But not recommendations from your mates or your peer group. They've got to be from people with credibility as far as your target audience is concerned. So bosses, managers, people that have worked with you who are in a senior position. Let's look at a brief example again on Matt's CV. I'm going to scroll now through to the final page of Matt's CV. Now Matt's CV is 3 pages. As I said earlier, it doesn't really make any difference. It's more about the content. So on the final page of his CV, you'll see earlier career. 2 examples of his earlier career. They're just one-liners. But notice, Enterprise Rent-A-Car, 95 through 99. Remember, we picked out one of his career highlights actually was with Enterprise Rent-A-Car. So it matters not when you achieved something in your life. If it's important and relevant, it can be mentioned on page 1 as a career highlight. And it's far more effective there than if we were wait until page 3 and stick it under this part of Matt's career, where it would actually be virtually useless. So how old a career achievement or highlight is doesn't matter. It's all about relevance. And then you'll notice there's a bit about his education, his personal details, and then the recommendations area down the bottom. That's 2 examples where people have said, look, this guy is as good as he may have suggested in his CV, or although that sounds a bit sort of boastful, he's actually able to demonstrate the skills that he's claiming in his CV. He can deliver in the areas that you'd expect him to. That's the important part. They're optional. If you don't have them, don't worry about it. But if you do have them, they're well worth using. Far more effective than references available on request, which I guarantee to you is wholly pointless. Final comment on this whole process. Briefly take a look at LinkedIn because, of course, it has a relevance. You'll notice at the bottom of this slide, for those that remember it, I said earlier, the vast majority of recruiters and hirers will make a decision on who to interview based purely on the contents of the CV. And that is true in most job application processes. Of that 92%, the vast majority, again, will check you out before interviewing you on LinkedIn. So best case situation, if they've decided to interview you, they look at LinkedIn and they see pretty much the same thing, it's unlikely to offend or stop the process. Worst case situation is you've got a CV that says one thing, a LinkedIn profile that says something slightly different. That causes questions to be raised. You might then either have some awkward questions at interview, if you're lucky, or if you're unlucky, somebody might pull the plug before they actually invite you to interview because they think something's not quite right. So LinkedIn's really important, if only for that very basic reason. It's also very important if you're interested in either right now looking for new opportunities, or with an eye to the future, building your profile and awareness amongst people for jobs that you might be interested in, or your career development in the middle distance, or even longer term, I guess. So if you don't have a LinkedIn profile and you're active in the marketplace and you're in a broadly commercial role, you probably ought to consider about having a LinkedIn profile. Quite happy to answer some questions about that later. Not going to go into the detail of that now. But it's not acceptable, generally speaking, just to copy and paste your CV and dump it into LinkedIn. And if you've got an ineffective CV, which by now you should have a pretty good idea about, of course it doesn't make any sense at all to replicate that in LinkedIn, because you're just making the situation worse. Don't get wrapped up, and don't think, if you're still not sure about how LinkedIn works, it's a deep subject. Don't get heads up about all the technical frilly bits about LinkedIn. Most people can survive pretty well with a well-structured CV, and then they don't have to go near it. You don't have to participate in LinkedIn. You don't need to worry about all the settings on LinkedIn, bar some default ones. What you do need to worry about is the message you're sending your target audience, which on LinkedIn is actually, it's not so much a target audience, it's an audience, which is very broad by virtue of the fact that you are visible to lots of people. Content is absolutely critical. That's the most important thing, just as it is with the CV. It's the message you're sending. Quick few pointers, and for those that understand LinkedIn, this will make maybe more sense. But if you've got a LinkedIn profile, you have your name. You might have a photo. Underneath your name, there's a bit of text. It's quite a small amount. It's less than a tweet's worth of information that you're allowed to have. It's called a professional headline. Just make sure, as far as possible, don't go with LinkedIn's default setting, which is basically taking your current job title and employer and linking the two together. Because if you've got an odd job title, it doesn't really sell yourself. That professional headline should be your value proposition. What have you got to offer the world? What are you good at? And it certainly shouldn't be available now, looking, seeking a job, you know, actively looking or anything like that. It doesn't send the right message. Underneath the photo, name, professional headline, there's a summary area. Again, that needs to be similar to an effective opening statement on your CV. So if it's just a load of waffle about your enthusiasm and dedication and ability to work in a team, that's not helping your cause. It needs to be more powerful than that. Don't provide lots of detail about your jobs, just summarize. And for those, most people don't know this section exists, although it is fairly obvious and marked. There's a brilliant area on LinkedIn called projects. If you can build up career highlights in the way that I've suggested earlier for your CV, they can be ported across to LinkedIn really well as projects in LinkedIn. And if you're not sure about what projects are, have a look around on your LinkedIn profile. Top right hand, when you're editing your profile, top right hand side of the screen, there's a button marked projects along with some other ones like certifications, education and bits and pieces. Click on it, have a play around with it. It's a really useful area for providing the proof and evidence to back up your claims. And when we're writing LinkedIn profiles for our clients, we reorder the sections. It's all drag and drop, or most of it is. So don't be afraid to play around with that. But obviously get the order in a more logical, building a business case order rather than just a random load of sections that don't really make a story. Okay. That's a bit of a brief reading. I'm more than happy to answer any questions about that afterwards. I said halfway through this that for some of you, you'll be sort of beginning to consider, okay, you might have arrived at this webinar thinking either just general information, you might be thinking, I need to do something, and by now you might have had that reinforced or not, as the case may be. But broadly, people fall into a number of camps. There's folk that are not really in the marketplace, but thinking about how they should maximize their profile at some point in the future. And for those, you should be equipped now with a better way of going to market. There are those that are actively in the market or have been active in the market, struggling and wondering what that's all about. And as I've said, it's nearly always the CV that's the problem, or the message that you're communicating. And hopefully you'll either realize that more clearly because of what I've said and been able to talk about, or you're beginning to think maybe that is the root cause. And then there'll be people who are about to go into the market for which they're probably thinking now either the CV is pretty robust, seems to meet most of what I've been talking about, so it should perform in the market, but if it doesn't, you know what to do. Or you might be afraid that your CV is not up to the job and you're going to need to take some action before you hit the market. And so if we're at that point, or you've made those kind of decisions, a number of choices you can make, of course, either do something yourself or we might be able to help you. Now, for those people that are interested in using professional body to sort your CV out, you'll have gathered it isn't the work of a moment, so I'm afraid it doesn't cost a few quid to sort. Standard prices for writing a CV and a LinkedIn profile via us and most people who provide a similar service is $349 plus VAT, which we know is a fair chunk of money. However, for people that attend our webinars, we discount that quite severely, although there's a catch, and the catch is it's time limited. So we provide a CV and a LinkedIn profile, complete root and branch review of both, not just a tweak, not just an amendment, for $275 plus VAT, so you're saving a lot of money, but it's time limited until a week tomorrow. I'll give you a link which will point you in the right direction shortly. So if you're interested in that, what happens is that you get to work with a writer directly. They spend a lot of time on the telephone or Skype or whatever with you, and they'll uncover what your business case is, what your career highlights are, what your value proposition to the world is, work on that with you, and rewrite your CV from scratch. They'll even look at job adverts that you're interested in applying for, or that you have applied for, or that you might like to apply for, and use that as a base. So it's a complete root and branch review of everything in terms of your message out there. If you're interested in that, you need to go to our website and you can take advantage of the offer. And as I'm talking, I'll also copy and paste the link, and then you can go visit that in your own at your own leisure. But you need to go to that particular place to take advantage of the offer. So there it should be appearing on your GoToWebinar toolbar now. Use that link. For the first 10 people that order, and it is strictly limited to the first 10, you also get free cover letter and access to our interview coaching package, which is a brilliant online system where you can pre-select questions and practice interviewing in the comfort of your own home, record yourself, and then review it at your own leisure. So there's nobody snooping in on you. It's a really useful tool and one of the good things that the internet has brought us. If you fancy having a go yourself though, and maybe a toe in the water, you can also order using the link that I put into GoToWebinar facility, that website link I gave you. You can order a pack, includes tonight's slides, a workbook, some templates, and an e-book on interview techniques for a fairly modest 18 quid, including the VAT. And if you just need any advice or help, or you want somebody to take a look at your CV, if you're still not sure whether you need help or not, we're more than willing to do that for free. So you can send us your CV at the email address that I've put on the screen, and we'll take a look at it, give you an honest assessment. It will be an honest assessment. You might not like what we have to tell you, but it will be honest, and it will probably be pretty accurate, judging by the feedback we get. So more than happy to do that, and then you can decide at a later stage if you want to take advantage of our services. So that concludes the formal bit of the presentation. I really thank you for your time. That's a lot of information. We try and genuinely give really good sound advice. It is all based on fact and research, not just stuff we woke up one day thinking sounded quite nice. And more importantly, if you follow the steps that I've gone through this evening, it will make a material difference if you get it right. But if you don't want to do that, or you fear your ability to do that, or your sanity as a result of doing it, then of course we can help. Unfortunately, it costs money, but we can help. Now, I promised to answer people's questions. So for those that need to shoot off and do something with their lives, then you're more than welcome to go now, and I wish you the best of luck and good night, and thank you for your time and attention. For those that have asked questions, if you just bear with me, I'm just going to freeze the screen right now, and then launch into the questions that have been asked. And see what we've got. Right. Okay, there aren't too many, which is probably good for everybody's sanity. Okay, how to write CV. I've not done CV before. Give me brief information about it. Okay, that's a that's a really big question, and in fact the person that asked it has left the building already, so I shan't answer it because it's very specific, so ignore that one. Ross, if you're still on, need an example of a contractor's CV. That's a good point. I'll show you one, Ross. If you just bear with me a couple of seconds, I'll just come back to that. Any other contractors online, I'll show you something else. Natasha, sorry I missed about emailing CV. Is this a free service? Yes, for anybody who wants their CV reviewed, we do that for free. We do look at them. You don't just get an automated response. And in fact, it's 99.9% likely that it will be me reviewing them. So if you send it to the address at the bottom of the slide you can see on screen, the info at blah-de-blah-de-blah, that will then get routed to me, and I will then give you an appraisal. It would help, anybody doing that, it would really help that you explain what you're trying to do, what you want to target job-wise, because that's obviously a critical part of the piece. Otherwise, I have to try and imagine it. I get it often right, but I can't always get it right. So if you want to send your CV, more than happy to look at it for free, give you an honest assessment. I'll give you a crude score out of 10 and then explain why I think that is so. But it really helps if you explain the kind of jobs you'd like to be doing next. That's really important. I was going to say something else and it went straight out of my mind. Oh yes, so if you visit the website itself, right, so I prefer if you email the address that you can see on screen, the info at, because then you can explain a bit about your career objective. If you go to our website, you'll see a button, free CV appraisal, and I don't think that allows you to put in much text, so it's less helpful for me. Right, I haven't forgotten you, Ross, just bear with me. Could you, Simpy, could you please give me an example of finance and accountant? I can't give, Simpy, I can't really show you an example CV of a specific people because we've only got a few default examples. We can't show obviously individuals information, but and it wouldn't mean a great deal either other than the one I showed you of Matt. The structure is very same. It's all about the content. The content's such a personal thing. So the most important thing I can say to anybody is that if you follow the structure of the CV that I showed you this evening, then you'll not go far wrong in terms of the broad structure. But of course that means nothing unless you get the content right. And that's the real trick, of course, is getting the content right. And the content's all about building a strong business case as to why somebody should be interested in employing you or more particularly interviewing you for the jobs that you're applying for where you know you could perform those jobs. So irrespective of whatever walk of life you're in, it's all about thinking, what are these people actually looking for? Have I got those abilities in my toolkit? And then providing the evidence on your CV to demonstrate that evidence. So it doesn't matter whether you're a finance, accountant, teacher, doctor, dentist, fire person, salesperson, project manager, it's the same principles apply. Jim, haven't forgotten about you, Ross, promise. Jim, what do I say if I have a gap in my career? Really good question. Couple of things. It depends when the gap is. So if it's most recently, and if you want to clarify that whilst I ramble on, by all means do so. But if it's literally you've done stuff and then you've had a gap most recently and now you're looking for something else, then again, you have to accept, depending on the nature and the reasons, we deal with all sorts of people who've had all sorts of things happen to them. So some people have come out of jobs, consciously taken a gap for whatever reason. Some people have come out of jobs voluntarily or otherwise and then gone into roles that just didn't work out. We've had people who've been ill, and when I say ill, I mean really ill. We've had people who have been carers for partners or family members. We've had people who've, all sorts of issues is probably the best way of describing it. And it depends, the devil's in the detail, it all depends on what's happened, because then you can make a decision about what's appropriate to explain to others or not. So that's part of it. Generally speaking, if the gap was most recently, the best you can do is explain why you've got the abilities to perform the role you're now targeting. So if you can genuinely claim to have abilities and build that business case, you just have to accept some people may be bothered about you having a gap recently, and just put that down to experience. You can't change that. Nobody can change that. It'll all come out in the wash at some point anyway, but just get your business case across on the CV first. And what often happens is people are persuaded by that enough for them to either be more tolerant of the gap, or maybe they might not even see it until later in the process when they're talking with you. That often happens, as a matter of fact. So you're not trying to avoid the subject, but you'd be surprised at how many people will make a decision well before they've actually read your whole CV. If the gap occurred further back in time, that actually works for you even better then, because of course the moment at which that gap needs to be talked about, just in terms of where it appears on the CV, goes further and further back. So it depends a little bit on your own circumstances, but our view is often honesty is the best policy. Obviously that's where the devil in the detail occurs, because you can't talk about everything. You might not want to talk about everything, but it's best not to try and think about trying to avoid the gap or minimize it. Try and think of everything you possibly can to explain about the gap that's productive to what you want to do next. And that, if you were doing any training, if you were doing any project work, if you were doing anything that makes people think, okay, well that's fairly normal. And there are lots of people who've had voluntary or enforced gaps in the last 5 years or so. It's not such an unusual happening. Simpy, my personal statement had keywords like self-motivated, team player, positive person. Your presentation was eye-opener. I will remove these from my CV. Good, Simpy. Yes, I was just trying to say until I got to that last couple of words. Get rid soon. Yeah, it's not adding any value. So many people go to market saying all that stuff. They're valuable qualities to have when you're in work, but they won't make a difference to getting an interview, I'm afraid. Right, Ross, I promised I was going to deal with you. Just bear with me, Ross. I'm now going to find a CV that's a contractor CV. Usefully, it's Matt's version as a contractor CV, and I'll try and put them side by side on the screen for you. Contractors are interesting. If you're an out-and-out contractor, we do have a different style of CV, interestingly, from permies. But there are some caveats which I'll explain shortly, Ross. Just sorting the screen out now before I reveal all. Sandra, I'm going to answer your question whilst I'm dealing with Ross's contractor CV bit. I'm going to multitask. If redundancy reasons for leaving are bad, what should I say? Oh, yeah, good question, Sandra. So the reason why redundancy, bad's maybe too strong a word. I know it's sort of your word, and I implied that in my presentation. That's got nothing to do with you or your circumstances, Sandra, or anybody else for that matter. I'm afraid it's all to do with what people perceive. We see a lot of CVs where redundancy is mentioned, say, 3 or 4 times, and that could be heartbreaking for the individual, but I'm afraid a lot of people out there are fairly intolerant or insensitive or both, or just plain so-and-sos, and see that as being a sign of something, irrespective of the truth or reality. So this is why some people are too close to their circumstances and fail to see what's harming them. I'm not suggesting that's your case, Sandra, but often people put these things thinking, well, that was the honest, logical reason, not realizing that there are other people out there who don't see it in quite the same way. So redundancy is a bad thing to mention if it's not clear that it affected a whole heap of other people. If it implies in any way that it was unique to you, irrespective of the truth, if that's how it looks on paper, it can cause you a lot of problems, because people just think, well, even though we've had a pretty tough economic climate and that's made life easier for people who've been made redundant, it can carry a bit of a taint still. But it all depends how you explain it on paper and what it looks like in the context of your career. So if you mention it 4 or 5 times, however distressing that might have been to you personally, it might appear to be a bit of a, this keeps happening, why does this keep happening kind of a view. And you know, it's horrible, because it might be nothing to do with you, but it'll be seen as possibly being exactly the opposite. If it's just once, again, it depends. If you were working for Woolworths back in, oh God, when was it? 2008, 2009 when they went under. If you're working for Woolworths, that was such a high-profile example, it probably wouldn't matter because people knew damn well Woolworths was in trouble and it wasn't the individual's fault. If it were Blockbuster, ditto. If it were any other company that's been a high-profile casualty of the recession, you'd probably not be tainted by it. But if it's you know, a small employer that nobody's ever heard of, or conversely a big employer and they weren't aware that they'd made any redundancies recently, you mentioning it actually looks out the kilter with the marketplace, and that's why it can be damaging. Simply please would you please examples of hot skills in finance accounting? Simply, Ross, I am busy on this contract CV, I promise you. Examples of hot skills. Okay, it depends on which bit of finance and accounting you're in, Simply, but if it were payroll, it would be things like Sage and their payroll system. If it were accounting and you'd used a particular version of Sage, like Sage Line 50, be that multi-currency or single currency, it's that kind of stuff. It's stuff that you probably see on a job advert or job spec. You need to reflect those skills back if you possess them. It could be balance sheet reconciliation, P&L analysis, it could be Microsoft Excel advanced user, what else could it be for finance account, cash flow analysis, cash flow forecasting, those kind of things. I hope that gives you a bit of a clue. Right, just bear with me, Ross, I am so close. Right. Okay, sorry, I'm just a bit of pausing. Multitasking for a mail at nigh on 9 o'clock at night is never a good idea, and so I'm very close to. Right, just if anybody asks a question, I'm just going to ignore you for a couple of hours because I've been hanging Ross on the line for a while. Let me just show a couple of things on screen. So, sorry, to anybody looking at the screen now, you'll see an unholy mess as I desperately try and align two CVs side by side. So on the left-hand side, Ross, in fact, actually, let me magnify this first of all so you can see. This is Matt's CV again. So what hopefully you can see, same content, but positioning Matt as a freelance contractor, imagining that his business was the umbrella under which he was operating. So CVIA Limited could be his business, could be an umbrella company. He's a freelance contractor. Now you'll notice the first bit, the exec summary, pretty much the same principle. What is he? What's he good at? What's his value proposition? Aligning to the hot skills of the marketplace, blah, blah, blah. Key areas of expertise, pretty much the same principle, reflecting what skills you have, what the target audience would like to see. Difference next. So instead of career highlights, followed by career history. Now remembering this works really well for out-and-out contractors, so people with a really in-depth contract experience, people who are working either with employers who understand what a contractor is, and ideally recruiters who understand what a contractor is, not recruiters who think contractors are some kind of glorified temp, or have a temp desk that looks after contractors, because this format of CV is different and doesn't work where people don't understand the contract environment, for which the form of CV that I showed you earlier tends to work best, i.e. a typical chronological order of CV. This style of CV that you can see on the screen now, Ross, and anybody else who's a contractor, works really well for people who do understand the marketplace and who have a lot of experience and would find it difficult to lay out a chronological CV without it looking hideously messy or long because of all the different contracts they've got, particularly if your contracts have been 3, 6, 9, 12 months typically, i.e. lots of them over short periods of time. So what you see on the screen now is in the place of career highlights, you've got just a little box, current role, just explaining and making it clear to the reader that this individual is indeed a freelance contractor, that they've been doing it since such and such a year, that they've got experience across either a number of companies or sectors, just to make people feel comfortable that that's your skill area and you're a valid applicant, as it were. And then we're providing quite a lot of case study evidence. So we've called them project or assignments, but it's case study evidence. So it's from Matt's career, where has he done things that are relevant to the target audience. Now, it doesn't matter. They're not necessarily contracts in their own right, Ross. They could be projects within a contract in which there were lots of projects. You could, in fact, have 3 projects separately highlighted and described from the same contract, if that makes sense. So often, so let's say you had a 24-month contract within which you delivered 5 major projects. All 5 of them, if they're materially relevant, could be on the CV separately. So the point is here demonstrating ability by way of case studies, not detailing the chronological order of things which have happened. We'll come on to that in a minute, but the main point here is building the business case by way of example, wherever those examples and whenever those examples occurred. Now, if you notice in the current role area of, I'm just going to highlight it now, in this area here, you'll notice the last sentence. Below is a list of assignments completed over this period, as well as larger projects from a permanent career in no particular order, and not all are listed. So that's the sort of the bit that says, look, here's just a sample of stuff that I think you'll find interesting. It's not a warts and all dump of my career. That's the point. If we go to page 2, should be seeing page 2 appear on the screen shortly. It's yet more case studies, and typically we put 6 to 8 different case studies on a contract CV. It's normally enough to get the message across. And then you'll notice the career chronology bit is just a line for everything. So the focus here is proof of ability via case study, with then just a summary to say, of course, people want to know where you've been at what time. So you just have a one-liner. Now, in a lot of people's cases, they've got a mix of permanent and contract roles, so we flag that. We also flag these days, it's not on Matt's CV, but we also flag any renewals or extensions, because they're, of course, an important attribute. If you've got lots of renewals or extensions, they're a good positive message to send the audience. So we put them on the CV. But it's a different way of presenting. Now, for some people, this works really well. We get some really good feedback, but we also get feedback that if you send this to the wrong people, so a typical recruiter who doesn't understand the contract market, they get all confused and they say, oh, I wish you'd put this in order of everything that's happened. Even though the career chronology bit's on there, they want to see all the detail in a nice logical order. If you're dealing with people like that, it's best to stick to the traditional format. But if you're dealing with people who actually see and understand the contract market, it's a really useful way of going about things. So I hope that helped. Let me just see if there's been any more questions. A remarkable number of people have stayed with me this evening, and for that I'm not, if not quite eternally grateful, very grateful. So there's been a few more people asking questions. Let me just check I've dealt with everything. So just bear with me. Simply, should the format of should the format of CV be different if applying abroad? Depends where you're going abroad. A good question though, Simpy. As long as it's Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Australasia, the Far East, the Middle East-ish, then you should be fine. The format shouldn't probably change. In fact, the broad format pretty much works everywhere. Where there are some differences are parts of Asia. There are some strange protocols about things like photographs. Most people, it's not appropriate to stick your photograph on the CV. But if we get CVs sent to us from India, Pakistan, and surrounding area, there's a a whole level of personal detail that just wouldn't work in Western Europe, like photographs, parentage, father's name, the equivalent of national insurance numbers and all those kind of things, which is just not appropriate in Western Europe. So it depends where you're going, but broadly, the format can work pretty much anywhere. Sandra, professional headline, not available. Ah, right, okay, yeah. So on LinkedIn, professional headline, I said don't use looking now, available now, or anything that implied that you're really keen to find something. The reason for that, I didn't explain it massively then, the reason for that is that in an ideal world, you want your LinkedIn profile to be like a hook. You want people to notice you on LinkedIn for all the positive things you've got to offer. They don't need to know what your status is. On LinkedIn, you're not obliged to mention everything in the same way that you would on a CV or be expected to put on a CV. That doesn't mean to say you can deviate from the truth, but it doesn't mean to say you have to put everything in your LinkedIn profile either, particularly if it doesn't work to your advantage. So we say build a strong business case, like on the CV, mention the stuff that's relevant to your target audience, and in an ideal world, you want to be creating an impression that somebody looking at the profile would be thinking, this person, in your case, Sandra, here's Sandra, looks like she's got the skills that we're interested in. I really hope that she's available and interested in what I might have to say to her when I try and connect with her, ring her, email her, or whatever. That's the ideal. Not always happens like that, of course, but that's the ideal. As opposed to the recruiter or employer searching for the skill set that you have, Sandra, finding you, and then you've got crudely, and I don't mean this you particularly, but maybe you've got plastered there, please hire me now, I'm available now, I'm desperately seeking, ring me, email me, telephone me, post me, do this, do that. That sends the wrong message, if you get my drift. An exaggeration to make a point. It's sort of saying, you've lost control of the situation, and now the recruiter's got the power because they know you're desperately looking, and it can even affect maybe even the kind of view they're thinking about what level of salary you might be interested in. It just sends the wrong message. So exaggeration, but hopefully that makes the point. So what you ought to be putting in there instead is, I don't know what you do, Sandra, but let's assume that you're, I'm trying to think of a good example. If I get this right, I ought to get a medal. Let's say that you're a salesperson of some description, and you're particularly good at winning new business. Then you need to mention, that's the thing you need to have in your professional headline. Words to the effect that an experienced business development person, not person is the wrong word, but an experienced business developer with a solid track record of winning significant new business in such and such a sector, or something relevant. That's the kind of message, that's the sentiment you want to be sending to your audience. So if they're thinking, and it's quite a skill to actually win new business, if they're thinking, we've interviewed loads of people in sales jobs, and most of them are just really comfortable at managing the current business, let alone going out and winning new business, that could be the little trigger that makes them think, oh, right, I'm going to read more. That's the difference, rather than, actively looking, please call me, or anything like that. Radhika, if I want to apply for other job than mine, how should I write this in my CV or my LinkedIn profile? If I want to apply for another job than mine. So I'm assuming, Radhika, that you're wanting to switch profession or discipline. And on your CV and LinkedIn profile, what you need to be doing there is that you need to try and pull together as much of a justification, so this business case again, that proves why you should be considered as a valuable candidate. Now, if you're truly looking to shift discipline, it's harder, of course, than if you had the experience right now, because most recruiters and hirers, their default setting is find somebody who's already doing the same job for a competitor or something. Oh, right, you said you've got experience. So good, if you've got the experience, then it's all about building that case on your CV and LinkedIn profile so that anybody reading it thinks, yeah, this person's got the appropriate experience, they seem to be saying the right kind of things, therefore we should judge them well. And you've clarified again, you had a similar job beforehand, so even better. So call upon that experience. Delay the point. You'll notice on the CV I showed you earlier this evening, we're not talking about where the person, Matt in this case, where he's working until much later than most people get to it. it's still on page 1, but it's right down the bottom of page 1 because we've spent all the time building a case as to why somebody should be interested in him, and that's what you need to do. Build that case, create the picture in the mind of the recruiter or hiring manager that you have got the appropriate skills, so that when they get to the what are you doing now, or what have you done most recently, they're already thinking, well, you know, if what you're doing now isn't relevant to the experience you've just claimed to have, at the very worst they'll be thinking, well, they must have got it somewhere, they must have had that experience somewhere. Whereas if you're opening up on your current CV too quickly with who you're currently working for and it's not relevant to what you want to do, a lot of people will get marked down for that, and you might even get rejected because people just look at the current job, it's the first thing that they lay their eyes on because it's too high up page 1, and then they'll assume that you don't have the experience. And the thing is, they won't, most people say, yeah, but it is on there, it's on page 2 or page 3 of my CV. It doesn't work like that. Most people don't read the whole CV. Most recruiters and hirers, that is, they don't read the whole CV when they're filtering them. They just read a little bit. Okay, that looks like it as far as questions are concerned. For those that have hung on to the bitter end, I wish I had something to give you other than the advice you've received. Hopefully that's good enough. But I thank you very much for your time. I'll hang on for about 30 seconds or so. Meantime, it looks like all the questions have been asked. I really hope you got something out of that. If we can help, give us a shout. It's obviously a great deal on offer for those that way inclined, but for those that want to go off and do it themselves, yeah, good luck, and I hope everything works out for you. I appreciate, sorry, just a couple of comments popping up now. So yeah, appreciate your time and attention. Good luck to all of you, and good night to you all as well. And I'll shut this thing down in about 25-30 seconds or so.